Hello and welcome to the first presentation for week 1, Approaches to Knowledge. The purpose of this presentation, as well as all the presentations for this week, in addition to the readings and the film, are really meant to get everybody sort of on the same understanding, baseline understanding on the concepts and ideas of empirical analysis and how to assess something empirically. While many of the courses, in particular the core, draw upon multiple different disciplines, from business administration to public administration, criminology, organizational theory, etc., nonetheless, at the heart of all of these sciences is a similar set of tools or outlook or approach to developing their ideas. And so we're using this week to sort of get everybody get their mind right, to get them oriented towards a particular way of looking at and assessing ideas or concepts. So we can start with something very basic, defining our term. What is science? And science is frequently misunderstood, and it's not really easily defined. It's not any general or particular body of knowledge. It's really united not by its subject matter, but by its methodology, its approach to actually doing what it is somebody is trying to do. In short, it refers to all knowledge collected by means of the scientific methodology. And there are a few basic assumptions of science. The philosophical underpinnings of science is called epistemology, or the study of the foundations of knowledge. And within that, there are several different assumptions. Number one, that nature is orderly and regular, and that we can know it, that we can understand it, that it is tangible. Additionally, that all natural phenomena are a function of natural causes, meaning that they're a result of. And because they are a function or result of natural causes, they can be known. And while it's true nothing is self-evident or obvious, with scientific assessment, it can potentially be known. Moreover, knowledge is derived from the acquisition of experience, and that knowledge is far superior to ignorance. All of these assumptions are built into the basics of science. Now, the aims of the social sciences, which your program is a collection of different elements of different social sciences, but the ultimate goal of the social sciences is to produce an accumulating body of reliable knowledge, permitting people to explain, predict, and understand our social world, whether it be in a particular domain like politics or economics, criminal justice, doesn't matter. And from the scientific explanation of things, there are several different concepts that we need to appreciate. One is that typically scientific explanation involves a deductive explanation, and that is that phenomenon is best explained by demonstrating that it can be deduced from an established universal law. In other words, you start with something very big, and you go down to a very big idea, a very big concept, and you go down to a particular event, or use it to try to explain a particular incident, or what have you. Now, there's another approach. There's the inductive, where you start with a particular and you try to generalize from that. But most social science explanations start with the big and go to the small. Relatedly, as part of the scientific way of explaining things, is the probabilistic explanation, and that make use of generalizations that express a mathematical ratio or relationship between phenomenon or generalizations that express tendencies. That's a lot of blah blah for, in other words, that we can, using math and statistics and other quantitative math-oriented tools, we can assess the probability of an occurrence. Another concept to appreciate is that prediction is the reverse of the process of explanation. In other words, when we explain, we're looking backwards to, explain. Why did that occur? Versus prediction, which is what is likely to occur, which involves a probabilistic assessment, what is probably going to occur, given what we know has occurred in the past. The concept of understanding has two radically different senses in the scientific way of explaining things. One, you have the Verstehen, which comes from Weber, which we'll talk about next week, or empathetic understanding, and refers to a tradition in which the natural and social sciences are seen as distinctive bodies of knowledge. It involves the argument that social scientists must seek the understanding of human behavior in a subjective or contextual fashion, meaning taking part, observing directly, etc. Then there's a completely another different way of understanding, which come from the logical empiricists, which take the position that social scientists can attain objective knowledge in the study of the natural as well as the social science world. In other words, very simplistically put, using logic and statistics or measurement as opposed to direct observation. One really important sort of scientific philosopher, if you will, Thomas Kuhn, argued that scientific knowledge is knowledge provable by both reason and experience. And Kuhn's image of the scientific enterprise includes a distinction between what he referred to as normal science and revolutionary science. And normal science is viewed as the routine verification of the dominant theory in any historical period, meaning that there's a theoretical understanding or a scientific understanding of something that is true versus false, and that dictates certain rules that everybody adheres to. That is normal science. However, Kuhn also argued that there are times when science is revolutionary and it involves an abrupt development, a eureka moment of a rival paradigm that can contrast or argue against or argue differently that which is accepted as normal. So, the earth was flat, then it was round. That was a paradigm. Those are two different paradigms. And what he argued is that, science generally falls in the normal everyday operation of things. We fall under a particular paradigm, and over time, something happens and there's a revolutionary moment, a eureka moment, and results in a paradigm shift. Now, that does not mean necessarily that the one paradigm per se replaces the other paradigm, but that there's a shift in the sense that another paradigm is acceptable. Maybe the best way is to illustrate this. So we have normal science at the top of the screen, our everyday activities where social scientists or whomever are trying to puzzle solve or what have you. They are making measurements, they're doing research, whatever. Something happens, an anomalic event. You might blame the apparatus or blame the measurement instrument that you're using or what have you, because it challenges what you expect to find. Then you get to the crisis mode where perhaps the anomaly actually can't be explained by an accident with your measurements or something like that. And it results in the scientists perhaps finding their faith in the paradigm, the accepted paradigm shaking, and perhaps that leads to what some refer to as a gestalt shift, which is a very fancy way of saying a shift in our understanding of the worldview. Gestalt is a German term referring to the structure. So we go from perhaps one structural understanding to another structural understanding. And over time, as you can see through the sequence that's on the screen in front of you, we eventually get to a new paradigm. It doesn't necessarily have to per se replace and delete the old paradigm, as we'll see in future weeks, but Kuhn assumed that when we went from one paradigm to another, that frequently it erased, it deleted it, it nullified the previous. One really good example of a paradigm shift is going from the horse and buggy as a primary mode of transportation to the horseless carriage. Now, this had many different effects throughout society. For example, the blacksmith shop, because all those horses needed shoes on a fairly regular basis, gave way to the mechanic's shop. And of course, over time, as the horse's carriage evolved to some form of automobile that we're more familiar with, like the 1957 Chevy, and it became more pervasive through society to have one, even two cars in a household, sometimes more. This also resulted in change of what a mechanic shop was, from a local tinkerer to a profession. And of course, over time, as cars became much more advanced, like the BMW, the ultimate driving machine, you see a paradigm shift away from the local mechanic to gas stations as convenience stores with food and drink, and the mechanics actually being hyper-specialized. Embedded in the last few pictures is a whole series of paradigm shifts, both in the industries that support the automobile as well as the automobile itself. In order to make science, if you will, certain tools are required, and At the heart of those tools are the methodologies that we use. Now, this is not a methods class. I spent an entire semester talking about all the different methods, all the different techniques for obtaining scientific knowledge, but the reality is that a scientific method is a system of explicit rules and procedures upon which research is based and against which claims for knowledge are evaluated. In many respects, it is tentative, it's open, it's self-critical, it can be self-correcting. It involves explicit rules about communication, thus encouraging criticism and replication. Beyond that, it demands competence in logical reasoning and analysis. The essential tool of the scientific approach, along with factual observations, is logic, which yields a system of valid reasoning that permits drawing reliable inferences from factual observations. And lastly, scientific methodology requires intersubjectivity, which basically means that knowledge in general and the scientific methodology in particular have to be transmissible, meaning the methods have to be able to be employed by different domains, regardless of what your interest is, whether it be political science, economics, or whatever. There are a number of different approaches to scientific methods. At the very highest level, there are the qualitative, which ask questions like why and how. And I imagine if that was my daughter, I would ask why and how. Anyway, it's very descriptive, it's very narrative. And that is something we're more familiar with. We're quite comfortable, with the written word. On the other side is more measurement oriented, statistically oriented, quantitative, where it's more precise. What, where, when. It's things we can measure. We think, frequently most people assume that that's things that they're not comfortable with. I think you'll find in later classes that, depending on how you approach it, can be really quite enjoyable. With respect to approaches to knowledge, according to the reading, there are 3 modes. Now, we're going to break this down a little differently in a few minutes here, but the scientific approach is one mode by which people have attempted to understand their environment and themselves. And according to the reading, there are 3 other modes. There's the authoritarian mode, in which the knowledge is sought by referring to those who are socially or politically defined as, quote, qualified producers of knowledge. Then there's the mystical mode, in which knowledge is obtained from such supernaturally knowledgeable authorities as prophets, gods, and mediums. And then lastly, there's the rationalistic mode, wherein the totality of knowledge is seen as being acquired by strict adherence to the forms and rules of logic. These aren't per se bad approaches, and these are pretty common sort of ways of breaking things down. I'm going to try from a different perspective. This is my alternative way of approaching knowledge. We have science at the top, followed by philosophy, ideology, and theology. I'm going to break these down for you right now. All 4 of these involve 3 different characteristics: empirical, logic, faith. What do we mean by empirical? Well, empirical basically means that it's something that can be measured. So if it's measurable, it is empirical. So science involves the combination of 2 concepts subsumed: empiricism and logic. It's rationally organized, which is logic, and it can be measured. That is what makes science different from everything else. It's the only approach to knowledge that is empirical. Philosophy, on the other hand, is simply logic. Competing philosophical outlooks are competing outlooks of logic and nothing else. There's nothing empirical. You don't have to prove anything. You just have to show A is greater than B, B is greater than C, and therefore A is greater than C. The end. Ideology starts with logic, but when logic starts to break down, it relies on faith. And last one is theology, which is simply faith. Religion is theology. So is the idea that the Browns might win a Super Bowl. You gotta believe. Ideology is incredibly important. The reason ideology is important is because as much as we would prefer that public policy is derived from scientific, empirical concepts, the reality is that ideology plays a huge part in terms of many of governmental policies, what have you, in particular criminal justice. And in the late 60s, early 70s, Walter Miller published a book, a series of writings on ideology and criminal justice policy and the ideological effects. And what he argued was that when looking at any policy decision or rule or what have you, you have to start with a hidden agenda. In other words, if you look at the belief system for those who espouse a rule, then you'll probably get a better understanding of not only what the rule says, but what their actual intention is behind the rule, because quite frequently the spirit or intention of the rule and the way rules are written often are disconnected. Beyond that, what Miller argued was that ideology was a set of beliefs about the correct order of something. Now, that correct order is very important because this goes beyond somebody's personal opinion. It has to do with their entire outlook of what is true or false, what should be, as opposed to what is. Understanding a person's ideology, their political ideology, is core to understanding why they make certain policy choices, regardless of what the facts might suggest. Additionally, within this criminal justice system, ideology is deeply embedded within the way we do things and why. And while the image here is a picture of a police cruiser, we're not talking about law enforcement simply. We're talking about all levels and all aspects of the criminal justice system. Quite frequently, the ideological issues are implicit. They're even preconscious, meaning that we're not even aware of them. We just take them on board and just subsume them into our behaviors or our outlooks, and they're usually emotionally connected. And what I mean by that is that they're deeply rooted. They are quite frequently part of our identity and how we see ourselves. But again, we're not frequently overtly aware. That's just why they're implicit. And another thing is that they're relatively unchangeable. And the argument is that by about 18 years old, our ideological sort of outlooks of the world are set, and your expression of them can change, but not the idea itself. And if it does change, then we're talking about a paradigm shift. Again, this goes back to the type of paradigm shifts we were talking about earlier. In Miller's writings, he argued that there was an 11-point scale. On the one end, there was justice. On the other end, order. And what he basically broke these down to a left-right or a liberal-conservative way of sort of generalizing or measuring people's ideology. And with those on the left, their paramount value was justice or fairness, and on the right, their paramount concern was an orderly society. And what Miller argued is that you had to look at both the convergences and divergences of these different ideologies when assessing a public policy, because all these convergences and divergences are a function of both ideology and philosophy. And while usually they don't conflict, sometimes they do. And according to him, sometimes disorder is a good thing, but I don't think it worked out for this guy here. Anyway, Miller also went on to discuss the issue of ideologues, those who attempt to control information and who really, this really kind of goes back to the whole definition of what an ideology is. An ideologue is somebody who pushes that ideology. Remember, it starts with logic, but when the logic breaks down, they have to go to faith, which is why for ideologues, facts are dangerous and they have to define them away. They have to define them in a way and reframe the opposition. These people tend to magnify a problem and focus on their belief of what that problem means. Now, while ideology in of itself is a good thing, it fuels social movements. However, the downside is that when policies are captured by ideologues, are seen as radical, or when the narrative of the day is captured by ideologues, they're seen as radical, and sometimes those radicals wind up actually behaving in radicals' ways, which frequently results in society pushing back against them for their behaviors rather than the message that might be worth listening to, perhaps. Lastly, some of the optional readings for the week are listed up there. I talked about the Miller piece, but down below it, the Line and Scheingold article really goes way beyond Miller. Miller is just laying down a concept for us to consider, whereas Line and Scheingold do an empirical assessment of major crime and punishment policies that have been enacted over the last 20 years, assesses them from an ideological point of view. Like, what is the ideology of the originators? How did they talk about those policies? What is the framework by which they originate those policies? it gives a really nice backdrop. It's a lengthy article, but it's interesting nonetheless. This presentation's over. You can go on to the next presentation.